Alright, so before we do some cutting, I would like to point out structures on a sagittal section. Alright, so first of all, let's just point out here the corpus callosum. Okay, remember I said if you put your fingers down into the interhemispheric fissure, they rest right here on the corpus callosum. Okay, so here it is, and so there are four parts of the corpus callosum. Okay, a little bit of a rostral portion here. Okay, then a genu or a bend, the large body, and then the splenium. Okay, so all of this interconnects the right and left hemisphere. Clinically, really important, we will talk about the splenium and how that interconnects the right and left occipital lobe. Here's the occipital lobe back here. And there's a fascinating syndrome we will discuss if you have a lesion there of the splenium of the corpus callosum. Okay, so above the corpus callosum we have this gyrus. It kind of wraps all around it here. So this is the cingulate gyrus. Okay, the cingulate gyrus is part of the limbic system. Okay, probably the best definition, what is this gyrus involved in? We know that the experience of having empathy for someone, that the cingulate gyrus is very active during that process. Okay, above that we have here the, excuse me, the superior frontal gyrus, okay, which we saw in the lateral hemisphere. Okay, and if we follow that back, we come to the paracentral lobule right here. So this is the central sulcus. So just kind of appreciate how big the frontal lobe is. Okay, all of this then is frontal lobe back to here. And this is parietal lobe. Here's our parietal occipital sulcus and the occipital lobe. Okay, so the central sulcus is usually further back than you might anticipate. Okay, so this then is going to be the motor cortex for the opposite leg and the sensory cortex for the opposite leg. So this is the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus on the medial surface of the brain. All right, so we've seen the anterior cerebral artery, and so here it is, looping right around the corpus callosum. So all of these branches here are off of the anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so importantly, we can follow this right up here and see that this would supply then the paracentral lobule. Okay, now if we just turn this over, we can see again the gyrus rectus right here. Here is the temporal lobe with the paraepicampal gyrus and the uncus. Okay, so just as you're doing the lab here, just always orient yourself, make sure you remember where you're at. All right, so as I said, this is all parietal lobe. Here's the parietal occipital sulcus. So this is the occipital lobe. Okay, so the calcarine fissure is right here. And this separates the occipital lobe below, which is the lingula, with the occipital lobe above, which is the cuneus. So our primary visual cortex is all going to be located around this. Okay, so here's the parietal occipital sulcus. So this area right here then would be the precuneus of the parietal lobe. Okay, and again this would be the cingulate gyrus, but now of the parietal lobe and of the frontal lobe. All right, so the corpus callosum then is this kind of the floor of all of this that's above it. And we have some non-neural tissue right here. This is the septum pellucidum, okay, that separates the right and left lateral ventricle, where the cerebral spinal fluid is located. So if I were just to push my probe inside there, it's now in the lateral ventricle. Okay. So cerebral spinal fluid is produced in all three ventricles, but most of it is produced in the lateral ventricle by the choroid plexus. And so if we were just to do some dissecting in here, you would find some kind of cheesy material. You can see a little bit of it right there. Okay, that is the choroid plexus, okay, that makes CSF. So cerebrospinal fluid, then it gets produced here in the lateral ventricle, and we just want to follow its course. So it goes from the lateral ventricle through this space right here. Okay, this is the interventricular foramen of Monroe. Okay, so that is the connection between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle. So my probe right now is in the third ventricle. So we have to kind of imagine the other half of the brain, and then we can see this is an actual space right here. So the third ventricle is associated with diencephalic structures. So remember, that means anything with the name thalamus in it. So this is the thalamus right here, and this portion is called the hypothalamus. So the third ventricle here kind of is the fluid-filled space between the right and left thalamus and hypothalamus. So from there, cerebrospinal fluid travels down the cerebral aqueduct right here, okay, which is a space we want to associate with midbrain structures, which we'll come back to in just a minute. From the cerebral aqueduct, it goes down into the fourth ventricle. And from there, and you can actually see them, there are outlet chambers here. There's a lateral outlet chamber, that's the lateral foramen of Luschka. And there's a middle foramen of Magende, which I can't show here. Okay, so from there, a CSF gets out of the fourth ventricle into the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space coats the spinal cord, coats the entire surface of the brain, provides a very important cushion protective function for the brain. So that's just a little bit on cerebrospinal fluid. Let's come back up here. And so remember, this is just non-neural tissue, the septum pellucidum. But here we have a very large pathway right here. Okay, and these are the columns of the fornix. Okay, so what does the fornix connect? Well, it's connecting information from the hippocampus to the mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies are right here. Mammillary bodies are part of the hypothalamus. So again, this whole thing right here is the hypothalamus. So it's the floor of the hypothalamus. Okay, where's the hippocampus? Well, the hippocampus is way out here. We'd need to do some cutting into the temporal lobe. Okay, so when you think about the fornix, we have to imagine information that's coming from way out laterally here, the hippocampus. It comes together medially then. The fornix goes from lateral to medial, and then it dives all the way down to the mammillary bodies. Okay, now what we're describing here is a part of Papez's circuit. So the first part of Papez's circuit goes from the hippocampus to the fornix to the mammillary bodies. But to complete the circuit, we need to follow this as it goes from the mammillary bodies up to the thalamus, and then up to the cingulate gyrus, and then from there all the way back down to the hippocampus. So that completes the entire loop. Okay, so Papez's circuit we think has an important function for memory, specifically laying down new memories. Okay, so we know that degeneration of the hippocampus out here is very important for Alzheimer's disease, the memory loss there. Okay, but there are conditions that affect the mammillary bodies. One of them is a complication of alcoholism known as Wernicke's encephalopathy, where the mammillary bodies are involved. And one of the distinctive features of that condition is also confusion and memory loss. Okay, so we can link kind of those two areas with as known causes of confusion and memory loss. Let's talk about a couple of other pathways here. Commissural pathways. Okay, which means it connects right and left hemisphere. Here's one, it's really small, but you can see there's a little rounded pathway right there, and this is the anterior commissure. The anterior commissure, hopefully we'll see as we do some cutting, but it connects temporal lobe structures, the right and left temporal lobe. Okay, so if you're looking for the anterior commissure, find the interventricular foramen of Monroe. That's easy to find. Okay, and it's just below that. There's the anterior commissure. Another commissural pathway is back here. Okay, and this is the posterior commissure. Posterior commissure is just above the dorsum of the midbrain. So here is the midbrain. So this is the dorsum of the midbrain, and these are the superior and inferior colliculi, which I'll show you in just a minute. So right above that is the posterior commissure. Posterior commissure is important for the pupillary light reflex. Okay, so when you shine a light in one eye and both pupils constrict, the posterior commissure is involved in that. Okay, so as I said, here's the thalamus. Okay, and later on we go through each of the individual thalamic nuclei and talk about what they do. Here is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, if we're looking for things around the hypothalamus, we've already pointed out the anterior commissure is above, the interventricular foramen of Monroe is above. The floor of the hypothalamus is formed by the mammillary bodies right here, which is part of the hypothalamus. And then we have a myelinated pathway right here, and this is the optic chiasm. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this over. So again, we've cut through the midline of the brain. So here's the optic nerve, and here's the optic chiasm, which we've cut through right there. Okay, so the optic chiasm, we want to associate that as kind of being the ventral portion of the hypothalamus, and our pituitary sits right there. So remember, I said that a pituitary tumor will compress the optic chiasm and give patients a distinctive pattern of visual loss. Okay, just realizing I forgot to mention here, I told you about the cingulate gyrus. So the sulcus right above that is the cingulate sulcus, and that separates the cingulate gyrus from the superior frontal gyrus above, cingulate sulcus. Okay, so before we get to the midbrain, let's just point out this structure right here. Okay, this is the pineal gland. Pineal gland, kind of right posterior to the posterior commissure, sitting right on the dorsum of the midbrain, which is really important. Okay, if we have a tumor of the pineal gland, it's called a pinealoma. Okay, as that expands, it often will compress the dorsum of the midbrain. And this part of the midbrain is very important for vertical eye movements. So a tumor here will impair a patient's ability to look up and down, as we'll discuss. And also, this could easily occlude the cerebral aqueduct. So remember, we have spinal fluid, CSF traveling through there. So if we occlude that, then the CSF being produced in the lateral and third ventricles has nowhere to go, and patients can develop a non-communicating hydrocephalus. All right, let's talk about the midbrain a little bit. So the lateral portion of the midbrain are the cerebral peduncles, which we don't see here because they're lateral, and we're just looking at a midline section. But if I were to put my probe in here and wrap all the way around, then I would be touching the cerebral peduncle. So let's just do that. Okay, so notice right there, that huge pathway right there is the cerebral peduncle. So remember the cranial nerves, we've associated that with that. The third nerve, and wrapping around the cerebral peduncle, the fourth nerve, very small. All right, so I'm going to highlight here the third nerve, bringing this out. You can see that. So the third nerve right here comes out in the interpeduncular fossa. So this space right here is the interpeduncular fossa between the cerebral peduncles. Okay, so that's the lateral portion of the midbrain. Okay, this middle portion of the midbrain right here is called the tegmentum. Okay, there are a lot of important things in the tegmentum: the red nucleus, the substantia nigra. Okay, we'll see those hopefully as we do some cutting. Now, I don't know how well this will show up, but there's a little pathway right there, just a little wider area right there, and that is actually the medial longitudinal fasciculus, okay, which is an important connection up to the third nerve nucleus, which is about in this area. This is the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So this is a pathway that is frequently damaged in patients that have multiple sclerosis. Okay, and this pathway coordinates the medial rectus muscle when you look from side to side. So a lesion, or usually demyelination here, will impair a patient's ability to look to the nose on this side. That's called an internuclear ophthalmoplegia, and that's an important syndrome to know about. All right, so this is all in the tectum of the midbrain. Again, here's the cerebral aqueduct, and so back here we have the superior and inferior colliculus. Okay. So if we look at the dorsum there, you can see there's a bump right there, above and below. That's the tectum of the midbrain, superior and inferior colliculus. All right, here's the large pons right here, and of course the medulla below, and we'll point out some important things here as we do some cutting. Also, you should just notice we've got a large blood vessel here. So what blood vessel sits on the pons? This has to be the basilar artery. All right, I've already pointed out the fourth ventricle. So here is the midline of the cerebellum. So we have the anterior lobe here and the posterior lobe, which is much larger here in this location. All right, I think that's all I'll point out on the sagittal.